Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio Technician class, session number 11. So before we get into the session, we recognize that several of our participants are from various islands of the Caribbean, and of course, we would have just had to deal with Tropical Storm Brett. So again, we know a couple of persons might have been affected, and we certainly our hearts, go out to them, and our thoughts and prayers are with those persons affected one way or the other in the system, right? So let's go. So our previous session, we dealt with our Q&A. We had our curriculum progress. We talked about our usual recommendation practice exams. Then the technical topics we got into SWR meters, RF power meters. We also dealt with antenna analyzers. We talked about antenna tuners, what dummy loads are. Then we went into modulation, where we talked about AM, FM, and PM. Then we discussed repeaters, SSB, talked about bandwidth, fast scan TV, CW, and digital modes. And then we had our usual question pool review. So our agenda for this evening, we will look at our curriculum and see where we are. Then we will go into discussing again a reminder of the practice exams the participants should consider taking. Then we go straight into our technical topics, digital modes, packet radio, what's called APRS. Then we talk about PSK, DMR, WSJTX software, FT8 mode. Then we go into mesh networks, talk about electrical safety, electrical wiring, antenna and tower safety, the concepts of grounding and bonding and lightning protection. Then we go into talking about duty cycle and maximum exposure limits. Then we will do our question pool review and then announce the date for our next session. All right. So I'm hoping that the internet is stable this evening. We have been having some issues with internet connectivity. All right. So if we were to look on our screen in terms of our curriculum, so these are the main topics that we have, and this is where we are. This evening, we expect to complete amateur radio signals and also get into amateur radio safety, station safety. And we also expect to complete this topic as well this evening, right? So we're progressing nicely. All right, so a reminder to all participants, these are the URLs or the links to practice exams. It's never too early to take practice exams, and we know many persons have been. And we also take the opportunity to congratulate all of the students who would have passed the exams recently, become licensed amateur radio operators. Congrats indeed. Of course, just a reminder, the text that we're using is the No Nonsense Technician Class License Study Guide, which was distributed to all participants as a PDF. All right, so let's go straight into it. Our topics, we're starting with digital modes, and we would have mentioned digital modes before. So we say that a digital mode, when we talk about digital modes in amateur radio, that is essentially we are using a computer and connecting it to a radio. And in some cases, computers could be connected directly to a radio via USB cable, or in some cases, especially for the somewhat older model radios, you need to have an intermediary device known as an interface, or sometimes they may call it a TNC or some other name, but it's a device that sits between the computer and the radio equipment. So essentially, you're using your computer to do the talking. The computer will modulate the signal. It will send the information across to the radio. The radio will generate the wave and impose upon it the tones that's generated by the computer through the interface. And then the radio will transmit that signal out to the antenna via the transmission line. And that radio signal leaves the antenna, goes off into the air, and is propagated until it is collected by another amateur radio operator's antenna, and the reverse occurs. It goes to the radio and it sends the signal to the computer, and it's decoded, and you'll see the information that was sent by the sender amateur on the receiver's computer, and you'll see the text and the information or whatever is being sent as information represented. So digital modes mean that we are using a computer to do the talking or to send, as opposed to a microphone that we will speak into. So digital modes means a computer connected to our radio, more or less. All right, so there are several digital modes. Now, we touched on this one previously, packet radio. So we'll just get a little more into what packet radio is, because we do have a couple of exam questions in relation to packet radio. So remember we said digital modes. You have a computer with maybe an interface connecting to a radio, and the radio goes to the antenna, right? So here's another diagram here of a packet radio setup. You have your computer, what is called a TNC, terminal node controller, but it's an interface onto the radio, onto the antenna. Another way of showing this as a block diagram. And packet radio is one way of signaling from the computer to the radio and sending that information out via radio waves, right? So packet radio, because it's packetized information that is sent across to the radio, and it's sent out over the airways and received by another amateur radio, converted into packets and sent to the receiving computer. So those little packets are chunks of information, consider it as little envelopes that we'll put information in and send on our way as envelope by envelope until all of the information is sent and received, and it's reassembled on the other end. So that is what we mean by packet radio, using a computer, interfacing it to the computer, and using that mode called packet radio. And we'll get a little more into what that mode is about and some of the information that you need to know for the exam. All right, so here we have up again, we're still on digital modes, and we're on the mode called packet radio. So on the top right-hand side of your computer, this is a representation. So when we said we are connecting our computer to our radio, and we would have said that what we are sending are those bits that go across onto the radio, and it ends up as a radio signal. Those bits, or ones and zeros, essentially they will have a structure, and you have the start, and then you have the middle, and then you have the end of that packet. So we are just representing, not that you need to learn this for the exam, but we are trying to make it real and show you what the structure of a packet is. So you have the envelope, and it has certain contents inside of there. But there are a couple of aspects to the packet that we need to learn for the exam. So you'll notice we have a start here, and we call it, we have some flags. Then we have something that's called the header. Then we have the payload, which is the actual information and the content that we are trying to carry, or we are trying to transmit, and the other end will be received. But we also have this bit of management here. There's a CHK, also known as a checksum, that allows us to detect if an error has occurred. And then, of course, we have the end of the packet. So this is a conceptual view as to what a packet looks like, the structure of the packet. And in that structure, we need to learn and understand that there's a part of that structure known as the header. So there's some ones and zeros there, and the content itself, followed by what is known as a checksum. So these two bits of information we need to know and learn for the exam as components of a packet structure. So header and checksum. So the header begins just before the actual content, and the checksum allows us to determine whether the content was correctly received on the other end, because that checksum is calculated based on the content. So once the checksum matches, then you can say or conclude on the receiver side that the information was not corrupted, the information reached safely. So we need to know these parts of a packet for the exam. And we have, again, as we have indicated, once you see a bullet point in yellow, 99% of the time, it's related to an exam question. So we need to learn these things. So we say that the following are included in packet radio transmissions: a header, and this is where the arrow is pointing. So you have the header part of the packet that contains the call sign of the station to which the information is being sent. So in other words, the receiver, right? So the receiver's call sign is inside of that header. We also need to learn about the checksum, and a checksum permits error correction. So we need to learn that the checksum at the end allows us to detect whether we have any errors inside of there. So that's error detection. Did I say correction? So error detection. And of course, there's another concept with packets that we need to learn called ARQ, or automatic repeat request. So what that does is, in case there's an error, it will resend the packet. So we need to learn these things about packet radio, because they are going to come in the exam. They'll ask you what's included in the packet header, and it's all of these three things. So the answer will be all of the above, right? So another question, an exam question, they will ask you about that same ARQ that I mentioned, automatic repeat request. So we have a little blurb as to what ARQ is, but what we need to learn for the exam is that ARQ is a method of error correction. So we're sending information across. This is the information, the structure that's being sent across using the radio. It's being received. It should be received in good order. But how do we know if it has been? Well, if it is that a packet is sent, what we do will be acknowledge the receipt of the packet. But if it is that we do not receive an acknowledgement, we know it has not reached, and we will resend. So that is what ARQ, or automatic repeat request, is about. And it's an exam question, so we need to learn this for the exam. So we say an ARQ transmission system is an error correction method in which the receiving station detects errors and sends a request for retransmission. So we need to learn this point for the exam. So again, all under packet radio. So we are coming now to a packet radio related type of signal. So again, folks, we're talking about digital modes. Remember, when we talk digital modes, there's some sort of computer that is communicating with a radio, right? So it's a digital mode. And notice this one is called APRS, Automatic Packet Reporting System. And you may say, but wait a minute, we just talked about packet radio. Is it related? Yes, it is, because we are also using packets in this mode called APRS, Automatic Packet Reporting System. But you may ask yourself, what is this APRS about? Well, on your screen, we have a map, and you will see various points on the map. You might recognize some of these as shipping vessels. You might recognize some of these as other types of information on the map showing location of different objects. Well, APRS is sort of like GPS tracking in amateur radio. So on our right-hand side here, we have a transceiver. It's a walkie-talkie or a handheld radio. It has a GPS built in, and this radio has the capability of sending out APRS packets. It will transmit these APRS packets on a frequency, and then we will have a receiver. So there's an antenna that will receive that signal, connect to what is called an eye gate, and this is essentially a computer. That computer is networked to the internet and sent to this website that you're seeing on your screen, aprs.fi. And we like to encourage participants, take a look at this website. Pretty cool. You can zoom into the country that you live in, and you'll see if there are any amateur radio operators that's beaconing a station location, or maybe a weather station, or maybe their hotspot, or if you have a ham that's also taking signals from marine vessel, what you call AIS signals, and putting it out onto the map via this method called APRS, right? So note, APRS, you use a GPS on the radio, it transmits the GPS latitude and longitude, or the location. Again, just like we have been accustomed to APRS, using, I should say, GPS, when we use Waze or Google Maps and we are tracking ourselves, or we are looking to see where we are on a map. Well, amateur radio operators do this with our radios. So that mode is called APRS, and it transmits packets into the air. It's received by another amateur radio operator station, maybe a base station. And this is essentially a computer, we're calling it an eye gate, and it sends that information to a website. For example, it uses the mode of the signal that is leaving this radio. It's called APRS, which stands for Automatic Packet Reporting System. So we say it's a digital communication system, and it allows real-time tracking, just like a GPS, and exchange of information such as location, weather data, and messages using packet radio technology and GPS. So APRS uses packet radio and GPS, and it's really cool to track yourself or track someone on a map using a radio like this. So you need to have a receiver that can receive it. And believe it or not, the International Space Station can also be used to send your signal up to the ISS and have it repeated and show up on a map as well. And that's actually something that amateur radio operators do. All right, it's called a SAT gate when we do that. All right, so we are still on APRS as a digital mode. So on your right-hand side, we have a little bit of a blow-up of the map, so you can see amateur radio operators. You may see some call signs inside of there. We have some ships as well coming in via another mode called AIS, right? Tracking those ships, right? But we need to know for the exam that an application of APRS is providing real-time tactical digital communication in conjunction with a map showing the location of stations. So that's just simply saying you can track yourself, or you can track a ham radio operator, or you could track a ham radio, or track anything in relation to amateur radio on a map. So that is what APRS is quite good at and good for. So this is an exam question. But APRS can do more than just simply send GPS lat and long, or they put you on the map. It can do a couple other things as well, and that's the subject of the next exam question. The kind of data that can be transmitted by APRS, again, APRS is Automatic Packet Reporting System. We, of course, have the GPS position data, Global Positioning System, position data. So, just like Waze or Google Maps, we are on the map and where we are located. But you can also send text messages. Yes, you can actually send a message to another amateur radio operator using this mode called APRS. Also, you may see some WX symbols on this map. Those are weather stations that are reporting, automatic weather stations, or AWSs, that are sending out real-time weather information, things like temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, wind direction, rainfall, and so on. And that information is available. If you go to this actual map, aprs.fi, and you click any one of these symbols, you will actually get real-time weather information, and you can also graph it as well. So that's why we say that another type of data that can be transmitted via APRS is weather data. So these three types of data are transmitted using the mode called APRS, and it's an exam question, and we need to learn, right? So think of this as amateur radio GPS. Right, so we're still on digital modes. Again, remind ourselves what a digital mode is. We have a computer that's connected to a radio and transmitting a signal to our antenna. That is a digital mode. So we have another one called PSK, and PSK is an abbreviation for phase shift keying. So we need to learn what PSK means, what it is short for, and that's an exam question. That PSK is an abbreviation for phase shift keying. And on your left-hand side here, we just put a little diagram to show you the signal. We have been sharing what signals look like graphically over the course. We have AM, what it looks like, FM, we have PM phase modulation, and so on. And this is a form of that, right? So we are showing what phase shift keying, or PSK, actually looks like, the signal. And notice we have the 1 and 0s, the binary representation of these signals. So this is just extra information for you to visualize what PSK might look like. And but the exam question is, what is PSK? And it is abbreviation for phase shift keying. And what is it exactly? It's a digital modulation technique. So it's a digital mode. And what we do, we vary or shift the phase. If you notice, the signal is this way, one phase, and then we reverse the phase and we come back this way again, and then we change the phase and we come back this way and change the phase, and so on. So this is why it's called phase shift keying, and that's a mode, or that's a way of signaling or representing digital information onto the radio signal. So it is shifted to represent binary data, and it allows efficient transmission of information over radio waves. Again, a digital mode, a computer sending this PSK signal onto the radio, and the radio imposing it onto the carrier wave and sending it out via the antenna. And you have all of this RF that's leaving and exchanging information over radio. So that's PSK, phase shift keying, another digital mode. Right. So those are digital data modes where you will have information being shared. Maybe you can send a text file, you're sending a text message or a graphical picture using those digital data modes. But we also have digital voice modes, or DV modes, as we may call them in amateur radio. Digital voice, where our voice starts off as analog, it goes into a microphone, it's picked up, and then we digitize it using an analog to digital converter. And then our voice is digitized using a vocoder, and that digital voice goes over the airwaves. So when we say digital mode, we have using a computer, yes, but we also have digital voice modes. And one of those modes, very popular mode, is called DMR, or digital mobile radio, DMR. And we need to know that DMR is one of those digital voice modes that amateur radio operators use. And what exactly is it? It's a voice mode. So we speak into our radio. So we have our handy talkie here, for example, and we're speaking, our voice goes in, and the radio, it's a digital radio, and it will take our voice and put it onto the airways using digital techniques, time division, multiple access. So that now allows us to actually have more than one signal on the same frequency. So that's one of the beautiful things about DMR radio. You multiplex two signals on the same frequency, right? That's pretty interesting. Normally you will have one signal on a frequency, but once you multiplex it or multiple access on the same frequency using time slots, you can have one voice going here and another voice followed by the same voice, and it's repeating. So it slices it up into time slots. And this is how it achieves multiple conversations at the same time. So you can have two persons talking to a repeater, one on one radio, and that person is occupying, she's on time slot 1, and another person, that guy, he's on time slot 2. Both of them transmitting on the same frequency, but their radio is, this one is presently on time slot 1. As soon as that time slot is off, the other radio transmit on time slot 2, and so on. And they do that very quickly. And that mode is called TDMA, time division multiple access, because we are slicing time up into pieces. So just giving a little chance to this radio, and then to the next radio, and to the, back to the other radio, and so on. And that's how it's a very efficient way of using radio. So DMR uses that technique of time multiplexing, or TDMA, right? And we create these time slots. But for the exam, in relation to DMR, what we need to know is that DMR, which stands for digital mobile radio, is a technique for time multiplexing two digital voice signals on a single 12.5 kilohertz repeater channel. So the width of this repeater channel is 12.5 kilohertz, so we need to learn that. But we are also digitizing and putting on two voices on the same frequency, right? How we do that is we time division multiplex it. So slots, right? So hopefully this is a visual representation of what is going on. But for the exam, we need to know it's a time multiplexing of two digital voice signals, but using a single 12.5 kilohertz repeater channel. That's the bandwidth that this signal occupies. TDMA as the technique, right? So excellent mode for amateur radio operators. And just by the way, FYI, there's a commercial equivalent. It's called Moto Turbo, right? So if you've ever heard that, it's very popular in the commercial space as well. A lot of trunk radio systems, if you're familiar with that, do in fact use that mode called DMR, or the brand name on the Motorola side is called Moto Turbo. All right. Just to also say, it's very popular because it's digital, it's very popular for repeaters to be connected to the internet. It's also very popular for ham radio operators to use hotspots, a little device that wirelessly connects to the internet, and it acts as a little repeater in your house, a tiny device called a hotspot. So you will see more about that later on in the course, and when we come into the general level as well, we'll get more into that. But DMR, it's a digital voice mode, and this is what you need to know for the exam on your screen. All right, so let's do a couple more slides before we take our break. So we are still talking about digital modes, and we did say that in amateur radio, anytime we talk about digital modes, we are talking usually about connecting a computer to our radio. But our computer to run requires software. So you must have some sort of operating system, and then you must have an application that runs on that computer. So one of the very popular digital mode software is called WSJTX, right? And the JT in it stands for Joe Taylor, guy who invented some of these modes and is responsible for the development of that software. So WSJTX software, or family of software, is an important suite of software that hams use regularly. And on your right-hand side, we have a screenshot what it looks like on a Windows computer. So this is WSJTX, at least one of the variants. And this is what you'll see in your computer screen as a ham radio operator. You have call signs, your call sign, the call sign of another person, and you're transmitting using the software. You're not touching a microphone, you're not keying a microphone. You're saying, okay, transmit. You click a button on with the mouse, and your radio will dutifully transmit that signal, try to reach another amateur radio operator. If you make contact, you'll see it change color, and you'll see that radio communicating, and it's the software that is sending the signals and decoding the signals, and we're showing you all of that information here, and you're seeing the call signs of the operators that's making contact. So here it is. There's a contact to Japan. Yes, right. So this operator here, 9Z4RG, is communicating with Juliet Alpha 3 Bravo Foxtrot Lima, which is a Japanese station communicating with a station in Trinidad and Tobago. So this is what it looks like. And there are different modes that the WSJTX software can work with. One that we'll talk about in the next slide is called FT8. But you will encounter some other modes as an amateur radio operator, JT9, JT65, and so on. So these are some of the modes that the software called WSJTX supports. But for the exam, we need to learn about the software itself, what we can do with it. So we say that the following activities or operating activities are supported by digital mode software in the WSJTX software suite. So there are three that we need to learn, and the answer will, of course, will be all of the above, right? So you can use this WSJTX software to do what is called moonbound. So you may remember a couple of sessions ago, we kind of made a quip by saying that hams like to bounce signals off of things. You know, we bounce them off a water tank. We bounce it off of the meteor trail. We bounce it off of aurora. You may remember that. We even bounce our signal off the moon. So that's called moon bounce, or EME, Earth, Moon, Earth. So here we have the Earth. We have an amateur radio operator on one side of the planet, and we have another amateur radio operator on another side of the planet. So one may be in Trinidad and Tobago, and the other one may be, let's say, in the United States. And they are using the moon to bounce their signals. They don't have line of sight. They don't have that part directly that they can communicate. So what they do, they send using a directional antenna, maybe a Yagi. Remember those terms, a Yagi, and they will transmit their signal to the moon. The moon will bounce the signal back to Earth, and this other amateur radio operator will receive the signal, and vice versa. This amateur radio operator will send the signal up to the moon. The moon will bounce that signal back down. So that's what we mean by hams. We just love to bounce our signals off of things, right? So this is real, folks. This is something that is actually done. And this software called WSJTX, we can use this on a mode such as FT8 to send our signal, and other modes to send our signal to the moon and have it received. Now, of course, the moon is quite far, and therefore we may need a lot of transmit power to get there. And even if we use high transmit power, by the time it comes back down to Earth, the signal might be very weak. And that's the beauty of WSJTX software and the various modes. They are considered weak signal propagation modes, in that, you know, the signal is barely audible. You could hardly hear it. You can hardly see it on the scope, hardly see it on the waterfall. But the software will pick that out of the noise floor and determine, hey, I'm getting the signal, and it will interpret the signal and show you the information on your screen, even though the signal is very weak. Look at this transmission here, minus 24 dB. That's a pretty weak signal, but yet it's picking up the information. Some stronger signals, minus 3. 1 dB, pretty strong signals, but some weak signals in there. We have minus 17, minus 19, minus 24. That's probably as low as you will go, but it is getting that weak signal and pulling it out, and it's displaying the call signs of the stations that you're hearing. So EME, or Earth, Moon, Earth, is one of the activities that the WSJTX software supports, because it's a weak signal mode, and it does very well with weak signals. And that's the other point here, weak signal propagation beacon. So what a propagation beacon is that a ham or some other station will have a amateur radio transmitter that is just beaconing, sending out a signal, sending out a signal, sending out a signal. That's a beacon, just like a lighthouse. If you're familiar with a lighthouse, it beacons a light for ships. Sort of back in the day, but still, so there are still lighthouses around, and that's a beacon. It will send that light out. Just so radio waves beacon, it will send it out. and it gives you a good idea of propagation. As there are conditions that we can communicate. The condition's good. I'm hearing the beacon, so that means I have a good path to that beacon, and therefore it may mean I could communicate with a ham on that side of the world. So those propagation beacons exist, and the WSGTX software can be used for that as well. And last but not least, again, we said hams love to bounce our signals. We did talk about it in a previous session. We bounce our signals off of the trail that a meteor leaves as it comes through Earth. Remember, we said the meteor as it passed through the Earth will ionize some of the atmosphere, and we can bounce our radio signals off of that streak for maybe a couple of seconds, maybe a couple of minutes, right? And that's called meteor scatter. And we can use that software, WSGTX, to achieve meteor scatter. All right, let's do another slide before we take a break. So still with digital modes, and we did say one of the modes that the WSGTX software supports is FT8. Now on the right hand side here, we're just sort of showing a waterfall display as to what the signal looks like. Just, you know, so you have a little idea on the waterfall, what the signal when it's generated by the radio and it's received, what it kind of looks like, right? Not in your exam, but just a little bit of information to show, you know, this is what it looks like. But we need to know that FT8 is one of those modes that's supported by the WSGTX software, and it is capable of receiving signals in what we call a low signal to noise operation. So notice again here, it's minus 24 dB, which is a pretty weak signal, and we are still seeing the call sign here, November 0 Alpha Whiskey N 0 AW, and then New Zealand station Zulu 6 for Juliet Alpha. So this software is able to receive very weak signals. So we say here that FT8 is a digital mode capable of low signal to noise operation. So let's dissect that. FT8, that's the name of the mode. FT8, that's the mode. And it's a digital mode. What do we mean by digital mode? That means we are using software on a computer connected to our radio. And it's capable of low signal to noise operation, right? So that means the signal is tiny compared to the amount of noise. So low signal to noise operation, weak signal, FT8 is very capable. And we, of course, use one of the software suites is WSGTX. So folks, let's take a break. About 2 minutes or so, get up, take a stretch, maybe have a bathroom break, a little bit of water, and we'll come back in about 2 minutes to continue our theory this evening. Okay, folks, welcome back. We have a lot to cover this evening, so let's go again. All right, so I think we stopped here, which is talking about FT8 being a digital mode capable of low signal to noise operations. FT8. Okay, so would you know, or do you imagine that amateur radio operators will use Wi-Fi routers or Wi-Fi access points, modify the firmware and use them to create networks? Just like you have Wi-Fi routers in the corporate environment or the home environment that you use to have wireless access, Wi-Fi. Hams can also use those same devices, repurpose them by replacing the firmware or the software that's on the devices with software that allows hams to put their call signs on the device and also use some additional frequencies, part of the spectrum, as well as run different or higher power levels compared to what consumers could run. So when hams do that and repurpose Wi-Fi routers, so we have some pretty older, these Linksys WRT 54G routers, these older routers we're showing here, but it can also use the newer Ubiquiti type routers and a couple others as well. And once you replace the firmware with one of the popular ones, so you have Broadband Hamnet or HSMM Mesh, that's one has kind of been replaced now with the one that's called AREDN, Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. Those are the custom firmware that's available from these organizations, and you can upload or flash the firmware on these routers to make them capable of becoming amateur radio mesh networks. And what a mesh network is that this router will be able to communicate with this router and this router and will communicate with this one and so on. This router cannot see this router because there's a mountain, and this router cannot see this router here because it's a tree. But once routers can see each other in this mesh network using the specialized firmware that hams are allowed to use, they can then create a network where it could be quite resilient, where you can communicate wirelessly using this router here to someone who is across town using this router here, but not directly. They go through other routers and hop from one to the next. And this is considered a mesh network because you have one-to-many or many-to-many type connections here, and it will find the best route. And there are routing protocols that will allow for that. So the routed protocol will typically be TCP/IP, and then you have routing protocols that will allow these networks, these devices to talk to each other. And if a router were to go down, or one of these access points were to go down, the network will automatically reconfigure and find the best route to get your information or data or packets across the network. So this is a mesh network that we are representing here on your screen, and hams do in fact do that. We update the firmware here to enable the creation of the mesh network. And these are pretty high speed networks compared to some of the speeds that amateur radio operators would normally use, right? So you can even connect one of these or more than one to the internet and have internet access through these devices as well. So this is a pretty exciting, good fun stuff. One of the things that amateur radio operators are able to do. But we do have an exam question in relation to mesh networks. And that is, an amateur radio mesh network is best described as an amateur radio-based data network using commercial Wi-Fi equipment with modified firmware. So let's dissect what this means here. So we're talking about a mesh network for amateur radio. And it's an amateur radio-based data network. So it's a data network, so you're allowed to have information transferred using the network. And it uses commercial Wi-Fi equipment. So these are some of the older routers that you have out there, those Linksys routers, but you can also use the Ubiquiti type routers and others as well. So that's commercial Wi-Fi equipment. That's what they mean by that. Same one that you will use at home or in a business to get internet access, access point. But we are using modified firmware, and this modified firmware can only be used by licensed amateur radio operators, because this modified firmware, when we put it on or we flash it, or some people will say we hack it, then that allows these devices to exceed certain power levels and even adjacent frequencies that consumers are not allowed to. Their class license does not allow them to use it. But as a ham, that's one of the advantages that you get when you get your amateur radio license. You get access to spectrum and to be able to run certain power levels. But for the exam, this is what you need to know about mesh networks. So we have a little bit of extra information here telling you about the two popular ones. But just know that AREDN is sort of replacing or has replaced what was HSMM mesh, right? But we have both of them because you can still find these networks around the place, right? So folks, that's the end of that topic, and we are now coming on to the next topic, which has to do with safety. So on your screen, you see we're saying that safety first. So there's a little blurb on your screen. I wouldn't go through in the interest of time that information, but safety is very important. We'll encourage you when you get these slides, please have a read of this slide. It's very important that you be as safe as you can. Essentially in amateur radio, we are learning how not to shoot ourselves in the foot because, you know, sometimes we deal with voltages, we deal with radio frequency, energy, and we need to be safe ourselves and as well as have a responsibility in our community to not cause harmful interference, not to harm anyone else as well. So safety first. So please do read this slide when you get it, but let's get into some information that we do need to know for the course and for the exam. Safety first. We cannot emphasize that enough. It's very important. Why? Because electrical safety involves electricity and electric currents. And if you have ever gotten a shock, that's not a nice experience at all. Please don't try to go about getting one. But if you have had one before, you know that's not nice at all. And people can die from electric shocks, right? So we need to know how to be safe because electricity flowing through our body can cause burns. We can damage our tissues. You know, so many injuries that can occur if we are not safe when it comes to electricity. And for the exam, we need to do a couple of them. So we say that there's some health hazards that are presented by electrical currents flowing through the body. So if you get shocked or if you touch an live electric wire and current flows through your body, here are some of the not so good things that can happen to you. It may cause injury by, there should be heating, sorry about the typo folks, heating tissue, right? So it's electrical currents that's passing through your body and it may heat up your tissue. In other words, you kind of burn or cook, right? That's not good at all. It may also disrupt the electrical functions of cells. So your body has electricity flowing through it naturally. Your heart, the rhythm of the heart depends on electricity, your brain, the neurons. There's so many things that's going on in your body that an electric shock passing through your body can disrupt some of that. And then, of course, the other effect that electricity or current flowing through your body can cause is involuntary muscle contraction. So, for example, if you were to hold an electric wire and that passes through your body, then your muscle may actually contract and you may grab onto that same wire. So you're trying to let go of the wire, but because the electricity or the electrical current is flowing through your body and the muscle, your muscle has no choice but to contract and hold on. So you're trying for dear life to, you know you're getting shocked. You know you're holding on to that electric cable or that wire and you're trying to get off of it or try to disconnect from it and you want to open your hand, but you cannot because that electric current is causing that involuntary muscle contraction. So that's what they mean here. So these 3 points are what we need to know in terms of possible hazards or health hazards if an electrical current were to flow through your body. So the heating of the tissue, it may disrupt the electrical functions in your cells, and it may also cause involuntary muscle contraction. So danger, 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 safety first when it comes to electricity. All right, so we have a slide here for you. I wouldn't go through everything, and this is not on the exam, but seeing that we're talking about electricity, some of these things are important for us to know as ham radio operators. So what this slide is, I'll just take a moment or so to explain what this slide is about, but we will not go through it in any details. So you may have noticed that electrical cables may have different colors. So this is just to show that the insulation may have a color on it. On the outside might be red, might be yellow, might be blue, might be gray, might be green. And these colors indicate what the particular wire might be for. So we have the Trinidad and Tobago code, and we have the old code and the new code. And then, of course, because we are doing US-based exams, we also have what the typical US colors are. So don't use this as authoritative, but this may help you. This may be useful to you to know. And if you're wondering, Trinidad and Tobago's code, old and new, yes, there was this old red, yellow, blue for the three-phase, black, green, yellow for ground. We have brown, black, blue, and we have this way now, persons in TNX said, all the bees are live. So brown, black, and blue are in fact live colors, right? So sorry if the color doesn't exactly look like what we have here, but this is extra information for you to look at your own time. Another slide that we have that's extra information is the color codes of electrical wiring for different countries. So we have several participants from all over the globe really in this course. So we just thought we'll put up some of the, okay, so we have some people from India in the course. So this hopefully is your color scheme. I don't think we have anybody from Japan, but we have persons from different parts of the world, and this may be useful to you if you have a three-phase supply, if it's a single-phase supply. These are the colors that should be used in your jurisdiction. So just information for you to understand the colors, because we will be talking about colors, or at least one color in the exam, but we don't like to give halfway information in this course. We like to give something extra. So hopefully this is useful to you. You can look at this at your own time, your own reading pleasure, become familiar with the various colors. All right. So on your screen, on the left-hand side, is what is called a receptacle outlet. So some people might call it a plug, but it's really not a plug. It's called a receptacle outlet. And this is what you may have, depending on what country you're from. It may look like this. It may look a little bit different. But in Trinidad and Tobago, this is what it looks like. And in the US, I think this is typically what it might look like. You have variations of it, of course. But this is a duplex outlet. You have two of them. I said some people might call these plugs, but they're really receptacle outlets. So we will insert a plug into it. If we have a device, electrical device that we want to get power from, we will insert our plug into these, right? So this is on the wall typically. The faceplate is off, so you're seeing all of the inside with the screw and all of that, because we want to show that, right? There's a reason we're showing this. But this should be familiar to most of us. If we were to look on our wall, we should see several of these around. And we'll come to a slide that explains some of these screws, what they mean, and some of these slots, what they, but we just want to have a little blow up of it here. So you can see this is a receptacle outlet, and this might be the specification below for this particular outlet. And on the right hand side, we have, okay, this is the plug that mates or fits or sits. We plug into the receptacle outlet. So these things may be or should be familiar to us. And this one is a grounded plug. All right. For the exam, here's what we need to know. So the same receptacle outlet that we showed the previous slide, we're just trying to show a couple things. Remember we talked about the wiring. It has colors. So we need to know a bit about the colors for the exam. So inside of the receptacle outlet, the cover is off. So again, we're doing US exams. So we are using the US color scheme, right? Green, if you have a green wire, that goes to the ground screw on the receptacle outlet. If you have a white wire, that goes to the neutral screw on the receptacle outlet. That's on the inside, right? And if it's a black wire, then that goes to the live or the hot screw. And we're also showing a couple of arrows here to show what it's connected to on the outside. When you plug it in, the slot that it's connected to. So even though you're putting the wire connected to this screw on the inside, this screw is actually connected to this slot, the smaller of the two slots. That's the hot. And the white is connected to these screws here, and this is connected, and it also ends up connected to this slot on the outside here, the larger of the two slots. That's the neutral. And then we have this D-shaped connection here. It's called the ground. And so the green wire will go onto this terminal screw here, but it's also connected to this D-shaped port, and that's the ground. So when we put our plug in, that's the supply we have here. We have the hot, we have the neutral, and we have the ground. That's when we put our plug in, that's what we get. So we have a representation here that the hot or the line or the live for the supply is black wire. The neutral usually white. Sometimes we call it the common. And of course, we have the ground, which is usually green. In some places, it might be green with a yellow stripe. So this is just to give you a little idea. But there's an exam question that comes with this, and they're talking about the hot wire. So in the United States, the black wire insulation in a 3-wire 120-volt cable indicates the hot. So let's dissect what they're saying here. So it's the US wiring scheme. Black wire, it's hot. That's what we need to know for the exam. And it's, of course, our voltage is 120 volts. Certainly in the US, Trinidad and Tobago, and several other countries will use 120. Some other countries, you may have a different supply. But 3-wire is what's used in the US, typically 120 volts. And the black wire indicates the hot. Exam question. So let's continue with grounding. Grounding is very important. On the right-hand side, we have the typical amateur radio shack. Right? Just to give you an idea as to what you might be aiming for as an amateur radio operator. You have your house, you have equipment on the inside, you may have antennas on the outside, but you want to ground them, make sure they're properly grounding. And grounding is when you connect all of that equipment to earth. And that's for safety in the main. If you have electrical discharges like lightning, for instance, or you have some sort of other short circuit that's taking place, you want the electricity to go to ground. You don't want to get shocked. You don't want a component on the inside to be live due to that fault. So if lightning hits your antenna, you want it to go to ground. If you have a short circuit on the inside, you want it to go to ground, and so on. So that's why we ground equipment. So on the inside of our shack, we had shown, we have different components. We have our power supply, it goes to a radio transceiver, and then maybe an antenna tuner, and it goes to the antenna. But we are showing here that we need to ground these things. And so we may have a grounding bar on the inside of our shack, and we use these very strong cables that connect between our equipment and the ground bar so that we ground our equipment. And then the ground bar also uses a cable, nice thick cable, to go outside of our shack to the ground rod that is driven into the earth. And that's how we ground our equipment. And here is a little diagram to show how we ground. So you may want to pay attention to this. Grounding, very important. A bit controversial, yes, but grounding is important for us to understand for safety purposes. And we do have some exam questions in relation to that, right? So we need to know for the exam that there are a couple of ways to guard against you getting an electric shock. So one of them, we kind of discussed it previously, use 3-wire cords and plugs for all AC powered equipment. So once you're talking about our standard AC power equipment, you have 3 wires. So you have 1, 2, 3 pins on the plug. So this is a 3-wire plug, and it's grounded. So one is a ground, one is a neutral, and one is hot or live. And that's one way that we can guard against electrical shocks, by making sure that we use 3 pin, one of which is the ground. Also, if we connect all of our equipment that's using alternating current to a common safety ground. So that's the ground bar that we showed on the previous screen. Let's make sure, again, let's put it back up. Make sure you use a nice heavy gauge wire between each piece of equipment and your ground bar. All right, so we're using our ground bar, connecting all our station equipment to it. Again, that is for safety, avoiding electric shocks. And another way is to use what we call an mechanical interlock if you have a high voltage circuit. So if you have a power supply that's a high voltage power supply, on your left hand side here, this is a mechanical interlock. So if you open your power supply, you take the cover off, the cover is connected to this piece. When that is disconnected from this, it detects that and it disconnects the supply. So this is what the mechanical interlock looks like. It's a safety device that if you happen to open your equipment and you remove the cover, it will know, and it kills the main supply into your device. So this is an example of what a mechanical interlock might look like. So all these 3 are techniques that we can use for safety to guard against an electrical shock. Okay, so we dealt with fuses before, but we have a couple exam questions in relation to fuses. So a fuse is a safety device. So on the right-hand side, we have what fuses look like. And of course, we also talk about breakers as well. Breakers are similar in the sense they are they're for safety as well. It does ensure once the current exceeds the rating, it will trip. The same thing with the fuse. If the current that's flowing through exceeds the rating of the fuse, it will blow or it will disconnect. and save the equipment or save whatever it's protecting, right? So a fuse is a safety device, and it breaks the electrical connection when an excess amount of current flows through it. That's what a fuse does. So we dealt with that before. But for the exam, we need to know that the purpose of a fuse in an electrical circuit is to remove power in case of overload. So in other words, if the current exceeds the value of the fuse, let's say it's a 2 amp fuse and the current goes to 2.5 amps, it will immediately extinguish or blow and allow that circuit to be disconnected so that no more current will flow. It protects, it's a protector, right? And also that for breakers, we need to be aware there's a place that you install a breaker in a circuit, and we need to know that both fuses and circuit breakers should be installed for AC power circuits in series with the hot conductor only, right? So we don't put it in the neutral, we don't put it on the ground, what we put it is on the hot. So that's an exam question, and the hot conductor, the hot line, is where we are putting our breaker in, not neutral and not ground. Also, we need to know something about fuses. If we have a circuit that has a 5 amp fuse, so let's say this spade type fuse here is a 5 amp fuse, and it blows, it's defective, it stops working, the circuit has blown, or we have a breaker here and we have to replace it as well. Same thing applies. We should not use a larger value. So if this is a 5 amp fuse, we need to replace it with a 5 amp fuse. You would not want to put a 20 amp fuse. That's dangerous because then you're allowing more current to flow than expected, and insulation can melt, it can heat, it can catch a fire. So we have an exam question on that, and it goes that a 5 amp fuse should never be replaced with a 20 amp fuse, as excessive current could cause a fire. That's an exam question. It kind of makes common sense in a sense, but you wouldn't believe how many people do that. They look, hey, I don't have a 5 amp fuse. Hey, I've got a 20 amp. Well, I could use it. It fits. Very dangerous to do, taking a risk there. What you should do is get a 5 amp fuse to replace it. Do not put a 20 amp or any larger than 5, right? So that's an exam question. Staying with safety, right? So we have a power supply, and this is the circuit inside of the power supply. We may recall when we dealt with capacitors and filters and so on, that there's a kind of big capacitor that we'll have inside of a power supply. And if you remember correctly, capacitors do in fact store energy. So we need to know that even though we switch off a power supply, because of the presence of this filter capacitor that's storing energy, there's still energy inside of there, even though we have switched it off, at least for some time afterwards, right? So that's a safety consideration. Don't think because you unplug or switch off the power supply, it's dead on the inside. It still might have energy. And depending, you might actually get a pretty nasty shock if you were to open it up or you were to connect something to it, and you'll get a spark or you get a jolt, depending on the voltages and all of that, right? So for safety purposes, we need to be aware of capacitors in circuit. And that's the exam question. It says that a hazard exists in a power supply immediately after turning it off because the charge stored in filter capacitors. And this is an exam question. This is what a capacitor may look like, and it may store a charge or hold a charge. And we think that it's dead. We think that it's safe, but the capacitor is keeping that charge, that energy on the inside, and that could cause a spark. It can cause injury depending on the voltages involved and so on. So bear that in mind. That's a safety consideration with power supplies, the capacitor inside. Also for batteries, we need to be safe when using batteries. So this is a battery. It may look like one that you'll find in a typical car. So we may say this is a car battery, right? So hams may use batteries like these. These are the very resilient type of batteries, very lightweight, carry a lot of power. But we need to know that when we have batteries like this, right, what are we using the battery for? The battery is to supply our equipment with power, right? And it uses chemical energy and delivers power to our equipment. But these terminals here are the battery terminals. We have the positive and the negative, or the plus and the minus. And because it can carry a lot of current as well, we have to be careful that we do not short circuit the two terminals. If we were to take a spanner and, well, maybe I shouldn't say it, but if we were to do that, put a conductor from this terminal to this terminal and short circuit it, a very large current could flow. and we may get burned. They may cause a fire, and the battery might even explode, right? So that's the bullet point that we have here, that there is a hazard or a safety hazard of a 12-volt storage battery. That's this here. That if you short the terminals, meaning you connect this terminal to this terminal with any kind of conductor, like a copper cable or spanner or something that's metal, and you touch this end and touch this end, and the resistance is low, that's short circuiting, it could cause you to get burned, it can cause a fire, and the battery could explode. And remember, these batteries here will have chemicals on the inside. If it's a lead acid battery, it has acid and so on, right? So you don't want to do that. You don't want to short circuit inadvertently. So you don't want to leave it exposed like this. You should tape it up. You don't want something to fall on it, like if you have a large spanner or spoon or something like that, it will short circuit. So that's safety first. Also, we need to know that batteries, we should avoid charging them or discharging them too quickly. There is a rate at which we need to charge, and there's a maximum rate at which we should discharge. Because if we do that too quickly, charge or discharge, we might either overheat the battery or something that's called outgassing. So inside of the battery, you have chemicals. So you may have gases produced if you overcharge or discharge too quickly or charge too quickly. And some of those gases will be formed from the electrolyte that's inside of the battery. So you have hydrogen and oxygen may result, and that is called outgassing, and it might actually cause the battery to maybe even explode as well, right? So you have to be very careful. You don't want to overcharge, or I should say charge it too quickly, or you don't want to discharge or use the power in it too quickly. There are limits to that, and you need to know that for the exam. All right. So this screen is just to indicate what perhaps a typical, well, maybe not so typical, but an amateur radio station might look like. So we have our receptacle outlet, that's our wall plug. We may have a power supply. We could also use a battery, by the way, and we're powering our radio transceiver. We have a microphone now that's connected to the radio transceiver, and we may talk into it. And then we have a jumper cable. And remember, we said we may need an antenna tuner to tune up the antenna. It may not be a proper match, and we use antenna tuner to tune it up. And we have our feed line that goes to our antenna. This is on the outside. This is a pretty nice tower and a pretty nice series of HF or high frequency antenna, right? So this is what we might be aiming for to construct in our shack or as a ham radio operator, right? So just to give context as to what we are talking about here, this is an amateur radio station, or what might be contained. There are several other components that could be inside of there, but this might be somewhat typical. Fantastic tower, by the way, it's a crank up type. All right, so like everything else, we need to be safe. So that tower that we have, right, so that we just showed here, see this tower here? There's some safety measures that we need to take once we are dealing with an antenna tower of any kind. So for example, this is our antenna tower. We need to make sure that when we're putting this antenna tower up, that we stay clear of utility lines, because quite often these lines, these utility lines, are not insulated. Some of them coming from the pole to our houses may very well be insulated, but the lines that run across the poles are typically not insulated. They may be bare aluminum wire, for instance, right? So you don't want, when you're putting up your antenna tower with a lean and it goes and touches an electricity, maybe 3.3 kV or 12 kV or some high voltage, even the 220 and the 120 volt lines as well could be quite very dangerous. You don't want to touch in any of these wires at all. But of course, with higher voltage, it's even more dangerous. So you want to be very careful when you're putting up your tower. This tower that we're showing here, you're putting it up, make sure stay clear of these lines. That's the first bullet point. Important safety precaution to observe when putting up an antenna tower is to look for and stay clear of any overhead electrical wires. Very important, folks. There's also another safety point here, that you want to make sure when you put your antenna tower that you cater for, if it were to fall plop like this, that there's a minimum distance of 10 feet between where it could fall and the electrical wires or the utility pole. Minimum of 10 feet, right? More if you can. So this tower, if it were to get loose, or while you're putting it up, you know, something slips and it falls down, or maybe due to high winds, the something disconnects and the antenna falls. You don't want it falling anywhere near the electrical line. So make sure that if the antenna tower were to fall down like this, you have a minimum of 10 feet distance. And that's the second bullet point. A minimum safe distance from a power line to allow when installing an antenna is enough so that if the antenna falls, no part of it come closer than 10 feet to the power line. So even though we're just showing the tower here alone, remember on top of the tower is the antenna. So you have to factor all of that, the tower plus the antenna. So it's not just the tower alone. Include the antenna as well. And from there, 10 feet minimum. Safety is important. And also, do not go and use a utility pole to put your antenna on. So you should avoid attaching an antenna to a utility pole, as the antenna could contact high voltage power lines. So no. It might be a nice pole nearby, it may be right outside yours. Do not, please do not. No. Do not put your antenna on a utility pole. All right, so we have some tower safety that we need to be aware of, right? So remember we said earlier, electrical or electricity can cause us problems. You can get electrocuted, you can have current flowing through the body, it can burn you, it can affect you in so many other ways. But also, we need to be aware that our radio frequency transmission, so we have our antenna here, and we are transmitting using our radio. It has power going to that radio. And, there are voltages and currents that are leaving the radio and going to the antenna. So there's something called radio frequency burn. If you were to touch an antenna while someone is transmitting, you might get burnt. And it's an RF burn, right? Radio frequency burn. And that's not a nice burn at all to have. So you need to know, and that's an exam question, that a hazard that is created by touching an antenna during a transmission is RF burn to the skin. And that's a sticker here that tells us that if you touch this antenna while an operator has squeezed the microphone and is talking, they're transmitting, that radio signal is leaving, going through the transmission line to the antenna. If you have to touch that antenna, you can get a pretty nasty RF burn. So getting back to tower safety as well, there are a couple of things that we need to observe if we are doing tower work. We're climbing the tower, we're trying to put up an antenna or take down an antenna or do maintenance to the antenna. We may want to climb the tower, right? So there are a couple of things that we need to know and we should have in place. So the following are required when climbing an antenna tower. First off, you have to have sufficient training on safety tower climbing techniques. So don't just think, hey, I've seen someone climb a tower, let me go try it. Be very careful. You need to be trained. You need to be aware of all of the safety precautions before you think about climbing a tower. So that's the first point. Second point is, if you're climbing the tower, make sure you have tie-offs. So in case you were to slip or fall, you have tie-offs so you wouldn't fall too far. So you need to have tie-offs on the tower at all times. And also, you need to wear an approved safety harness. It must be inspected before use each time and make sure that it's good and it's approved. So this is a safety harness that this guy is using here. Nice, keeping him safe from falls and all of that. So these are an exam question, and we didn't know that this is important for antenna and tower safety. Make sure you have training, make sure you have tie-offs onto the structure, and always make sure you wear a harness. All right, so a couple of bullet points that we need to be aware of in terms of our antenna and tower safety. So first of all, never, ever climb a tower without someone else being there, called an observer or a helper. Do not do it alone. Never do that, and that's an exam question. Also, that if you're using a crank-up tower, so on the right-hand side here, we have a crank-up tower. So you may see it's telescoping and sectional, that this can go up a length, this can go up a length further, right? So this has been retracted all the way down, but this can telescope and extend up. That's a crank-up tower. We need to know that if this is a crank-up tower, that you should not climb it unless you have it fully retracted down like it is right now, or if it's fully extended, make sure you use locking devices. So you don't want to climb this tower and your weight, all of a sudden it slides down on you, right? So this is an exam question. Also, on this, the middle of the diagram, you'll see a tower. This is an antenna tower. There may be antennas along the side and the top, but you have guy wires, wires that hold this nice and straight and keep it from shifting and all of that. And you have something called turnbuckles. What the turnbuckles are, after you have put up the tower with the guy wires, you turn these turnbuckles to tighten and make these cables, these guy wires taut, right, nice and stiff. So you turn in the turnbuckle. But the problem with turnbuckles is that they could unwind. So the last bullet point here talks about using a safety wire. And we have a turnbuckle here, if you can see it on your screen. This is the turnbuckle. And once you have tightened it sufficiently, use a safety wire, pass it through and tie it so that somehow it wouldn't loosen if there's vibration or wind or something like that and cause it to loosen, right? So that's the bullet point here. The purposes of safety wire through a turnbuckle used to tension guy lines is to prevent loosening of the turnbuckle from vibration. So this turnbuckle, as you turn it and you tighten and make this wire nice and stiff, put a safety wire through it so that it will not unravel or spin out and loosen. All right, so we come to grounding again as a topic, right? So grounding is very important in amateur radio. So there are electrical codes that require grounding. So you might have heard of the NEC in Trinidad and Tobago. There's also electrical code, and it specifies that you need to ground certain things, right? So your amateur radio station will be guided in terms of the grounding by the local electrical codes that will determine what the appropriate grounding is for your antenna or your tower. So here we have a tower, the legs of it, it's going to the base plate, and we have some ground rods as well. And the proper way, of course, to ground a tower is that we have separate ground rods for each leg. So this is the base of the tower. So you notice we have 3 legs, but you'll also notice that we have 3 ground rods. This is an 8-foot ground rod that's driven into the ground. Another 8-foot ground rod that's driven all the way into the ground. We just have a couple inches above. So these are ground rods into the earth. And notice that for each of the legs of the tower, we have a ground rod. And notice that the ground rod is connected to the leg. But you may also notice that the ground rods are also connected to each other. That's called bonding. So we ground the tower, the legs of the tower, to the ground. So this is a leg of a tower, and we ground it to the ground rod. This is a leg of a tower. We ground it to another ground rod. And this is another leg of a tower. We ground it to a rod again. But notice these wires here that go from ground rod to ground rod. These are bonding of the ground rods to each other. So let's just read through these bullet points that are exam questions. A proper grounding method for a tower is separate 8-foot ground rods for each tower leg, bonded to the tower and each other. Good practice when installing ground wires on a tower for lightning protection is to ensure that connections are short and direct. So that's important. Notice how short, relatively short, these connections are. The wire didn't go all the way, go on the ground and spin across here and get it. Short and direct. It didn't meander all over the place and go all over the place. So it's short connections and direct connection. And that's important, especially for lightning protection. And this is grounding of a tower. Right, we have a couple more slides to go, folks. All right, so another couple of tips. Again, this is the legs or the base of our tower, our antenna tower. The antenna is on top of it, but we're just showing here the base, right? So you have the plate, you have the ground, and you have the legs of that tower. So apart from grounding and bonding, we need to avoid sharp bends when we make this connection. Notice how nice and kind of smooth they are. We have no 90-degree or 45-degree, we have bended, it's a kind of nice, smooth, all of these connections, nice and smooth, roundish, you have no, and we have a little diagram here to show the difference. So you notice how the connections are nice and smooth and rounded like this. We have no connection that looks like this. No, that's too sharp. For lightning protection, you want it to be nice and smooth. So we say here that sharp bends must be avoided when installing grounding conductors used for lightning protection. And you're seeing it here, nice and smooth, no sharp bends. Also, we need to know that all of these ground rods, so you have a ground rod here, a ground rod here, a ground rod here, we need to bond them together, and we need to use heavy wire or conductive strap. So make sure we have a nice connection between the ground rods, right? So and that is called bonding of the ground rods. Okay, so lightning arresters are used by amateur radio operators as additional protection. So yes, we are grounding our equipment. Our equipment is grounded to a bar. We saw that we could ground our tower as well. So we think we are okay. Well, in addition to our coaxial or feed line that goes from our antenna to our radio is another way that lightning can come into our shack or into our radio and affect. So what we do, we use lightning arresters. So we put that into the feed line or the coaxial line, and you'll see here, these are lightning arresters. Sometimes they may call them polyphasers. And it's grounded onto a bar, and then that bar is also grounded that goes outside to a ground rod. So this is our coaxial or feed line that goes from our antenna to a radio. We have a box on the outside, it passes through, and we ground it off. That's the lightning arresters. So that's additional protection, and that's the point we have here. A lightning arrestor should be installed in a coaxial feed line on a grounded panel near where feed lines enter the building. So that is essentially describing this. So apart from grounding our radios or antenna tuner, power supply to a ground bar, apart from grounding our tower, as we saw a slide ago, we also grounding our feed line or coaxial cable as well, because that's another part. It's copper inside of there. That's another part. Should the antenna be struck, it could come into our house and affect our equipment, or if we are nearby, not good at all. So these polyphasers or lightning arresters are used and will help with protection. I mean, lightning is something else, but we want to do all that we can to be safe. Okay, so in terms of safety, we need to differentiate and talk about the difference between non-ionizing and ionizing radiation. So what is that really? So non-ionizing radiation will be like radio frequency. So we start from power all the way to radio, TV, and even our microwave ovens and that sort of thing. So those are non-ionizing radiation. We have radio frequency that is generated. It doesn't affect our cells. It's just RF. We can get burnt with it, yes, but it's non-ionizing. It doesn't affect our cellular structure in our body, our skin, our flesh, and our different organs. It doesn't. That's non-ionizing. Ionizing radiation, on the other hand, there'll be things like X-rays and gamma rays and so on, right? Even UV. Those things can affect our cellular structure in our body. So we say that ionizing can be quite dangerous as well, very much so, right? So we differentiate between non-ionizing and ionizing. And we need to know that our radio waves that we use as amateur radio operators, typically when we generate RF or radio frequency, that is non-ionizing. And that's an exam question, and that's the second bullet point here, that radio signals are type of or it should be a type of non-ionizing radiation. So you need to know that we use non-ionizing radiation. We don't generate X-rays and gamma rays and that sort of thing as hams, right? Right, so we generate non-ionizing radiation. All right, safer in a way, but could also still be dangerous if abused and misused. Also, we need to know the difference, right? That RF radiation, that's what we use as ham, radio frequency radiation. It differs from ionizing radiation, and ionizing radiation, if you think of it, is called radioactivity, right? It's radioactive. As RF radiation does not have sufficient energy to cause chemical changes in cells and damage DNA. Ionizing radiation does or can. That's why, you know, there's a limit to the amount of X-rays you might want to take. You know, what your exposure to X-rays and these types of rays, right? Even UV rays and so on, you might want to limit those things, right? Ionizing radiation could be quite dangerous if you're exposed, because they can cause damages to your cells and even damage your DNA. So that's an exam question. The difference between RF radiation that we as hams use versus the ionizing radiation. All right, so RF will not damage your cell and your DNA, but the ionizing radiation can and does. All right, a couple more slides again, folks. We're almost at the end. All right, so as amateur radio operators, as responsible hams, we have to make sure, for safety purposes, that we do not expose anyone to any sort of harm, whether it's electrical or whether it's radio frequency. So there are things that we need to do as hams to make sure we do not expose ourselves, our loved ones, the public, anyone that may come by our radio station to any sort of risk of damage or injury, right? So we have exposure limits that exists. And there are a couple of ways to determine the exposure limits, and we need to know those for the exam. But what we need to understand, first of all, is who is responsible. And the person who is responsible will be you and I as ham radio operators, as the station licensee. We are the owner of the station, we're the owner of the building, or the owner of the ham radio equipment. We are the station licensee. We are responsible to ensuring that no one is harmed or injured as a result of exposure to our radio frequency, to our antenna. We are transmitting radio waves. We are responsible to make sure that we ourselves, and of course anyone else around us, could be our family members, a visitor, member of the public, are not harmed. And that's the first bullet point we have here. The station licensee is responsible for ensuring that no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limit. So we said that there are exposure limits. And who is responsible to make sure? Is it the FCC responsible? Is it the government responsible? Is it some friend? No. We, the station licensee, once we become a licensed amateur radio operator, we are the ones that are responsible to ensure that no one is exposed to our RF or radio frequency energy above the limits. But how do we do that? How do we know whether we're complying with those exposure limits? So first of all, we can do calculations, and one of the guiding documents that tells us how to do that calculation for us to determine whether our station complies with that maximum or evaluating our power limits and making sure we don't exceed. So there's a document, it's on your screen here. It's called the OET Bulletin 65. That's the name of the document, and it goes into how to do a calculation to determine whether your station is likely to generate exposure limits above what is acceptable, right? So the method is given in this document, and you need to learn that for the exam. You calculate based on this bulletin, the FCC OET Bulletin 65. That's the exam question. There's also another way. You can use software online or a website, and it's called computer modeling. So this may be an online website that you put information about your station, and it will then do a calculation and tell you what the maximum exposure is and whether or not you're within that maximum exposure limit. So you put in the parameters, you put in the figures, and this is a website or a form online that you put in. And that's why it said by calculation based on computer modeling. It just simply means you're using software, using a website to put your information in, the amount of power you're using, the gain of your antenna, how far, things like that, what frequency that you're using. And they call it computer modeling. That's just putting it into a calculator online. And also there's another way you can do it, is using an instrument. On the right hand side here, we have what we call a field strength meter. It's a calibrated instrument, and it will receive the signal and it will tell you what your field strength is, and therefore that instrument will tell you whether you're above or within the maximum exposure limit. So you can calculate it using this bulletin, you can calculate it using computer modeling or online, or you can read it directly with an instrument like this called a field strength meter. Okay, we need to be familiar with a concept known as duty cycle. So duty cycle, we have a little graph here that visually illustrates what it is. So I may be looking to run on a track. So I will run for 5 seconds, and then I will stop for 5 seconds, and I will run for 5 seconds, and then I'll stop for 5 seconds, and I'll run for 5 seconds and stop for 5 seconds. That's me running at a 50% duty cycle, because for half of the time I'm running, half of the time I'm resting, half of the time I'm running, half of the time I'm resting. So 50% on, 50% off. That's a 50% duty cycle. So hopefully we get the picture as to what we mean by duty cycle. But let's illustrate again. Let's say for 75% of that time I'm running, and then 25% of that time I'm not running. And 75% of that time I'm running. And it could be me running. It could be a motor that's running. It could be a blender. Some of us may have a cake mixer or a blender. We're trying to mix something and, or an osterizer, and we put it on and half an hour that thing going, man. And then we wonder why that appliance didn't last any time. Because we have exceeded the duty cycle of it. It was not meant to be commercial. It's not a commercial. We're using a home blender. And that really wasn't meant to be on for 45 minutes at a time, right? Maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes, maybe with a 20 minutes rest. That's duty cycle. If we want to use a blender to run for a whole hour, maybe we need a commercial version of it that we could run all day, all night. Same things with microwave ovens. Microwave ovens are not meant to be on for 2 hours. If you want to do that, you might need a commercial microwave oven. So duty cycle, is important in amateur radio for different reasons, for us to understand the longevity of our equipment, but also in terms of understanding our RF exposure. That's important. How much of the time the mode is transmitting versus not transmitting. So you have 50% duty cycle, half of the time it's transmitting, half of the time it's not. 75% duty cycle, so 3/4 of the time it's transmitting, 1/4 of the time it's not transmitting, 3/4 of the time it's transmitting. Hopefully you get the picture. You also have 25% duty cycle, so it's only transmitting for 25% of the time, whatever that time is, 75% rest, 25% of the time it's transmitting, and so on. So this is duty cycle in terms of our transmitter. And of course, some modes have duty cycles of 100% for the entire period it's transmitting, no rest at all. Some of them will transmit for a bit and then stop. And that has an effect on the amount of power that is emanating from your antenna. So we need to know what duty cycle is, and the definition of duty cycle is during the averaging time for RF exposure is the percentage of time that a transmitter is transmitting or transmitter is on, what we said here. So this is the definition that we need to learn for the exam. All right, so it also related to the maximum permissible exposure limits, folks. So duty cycle is one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels as it affects the average exposure to radiation. Of course, it's kind of how, if I go into the sun and I spend 1 hour, wow, I will fry, I will burn, I will roast. But if I go into the sun and spend 10 seconds and then, come back in the shade for about half an hour, and then I go and spend 10 seconds in the sun, I may get a light tan, maybe, just maybe, but I probably won't get burnt, right? But if I want to go and spend half an hour in the sun, I should put on, SP140 sunblock or something like that, UVB, UVA. So, that's the duty cycle there. So the same thing when you're transmitting, you need to be conscious of how much it's transmitting, because the more the larger the duty cycle, the more exposure you have to RF or radio frequency, and it's an important part of calculating that exposure limit. It's an exam question. Now there's an actual calculation that says if we have a duty cycle that we change, so initially it was 100% duty cycle, which means that it's continuously transmitting for the entire period. But if we change that duty cycle, we go to a mode that is only 50% duty cycle. What happens is that we can increase our power density by a factor of 2. Why? Because we have actually decreased the duty cycle by a half. So because we have reduced the duty cycle by a half, we could actually increase our power density by a factor of 2. We could double that. So it's a sort of compensation. We have reduced one thing and therefore we could increase another. And how did we get 2 as the factor? Well, we have moved from 100% duty cycle to 50% duty cycle. So that ratio is 2. So we can increase by a factor of 2. So you don't need to know this calculation. We just put it there. How did we get 2? This is an exam question. They will ask you, if you change the duty cycle from 100%, which is full on throttle, to 50%, what can you increase the power by? And the answer is a factor of 2. You could double it because you have halved the duty cycle. All right, so maximum permissible exposure limits, also known as MPE. Let's look at the right-hand side here for a little graph. So this graph shows the frequency on the x-axis, and we have the maximum permissible exposure on the y-axis. So notice that the maximum permissible exposure changes as you change frequency. Notice it goes down, then it plateaus, and then it goes up, and then it plateaus. So what that tells us is that all frequencies are not created equal. Some frequencies you could be exposed more, like these frequencies here, and some frequencies you should not exceed a certain amount, right? And we need to know for the exam, right? So the exposure limits vary with frequency. You notice that? So this is the exposure limit, and this is the frequency. Notice it's varying. It's not a flat line. If it was constant, you would see a straight line, but it's varying. That's what this point here makes. Because, why does it happen? As a human being, our body can absorb radio frequencies, but it is more efficient at absorbing frequencies on some frequencies more than others. So if you notice here, this range here, we absorb very easily or much better than other frequencies. So because we absorb a lot more or more easily in this range of the frequencies here, our exposure limits are lower. So bullet point 1, exposure limits vary with frequency because the human body absorbs more radio frequency energy at some frequencies than at others. And that's what this graph shows here. Also, an exam question, they will ask us of certain frequencies, 3.5 megahertz, 50 megahertz, 440 megahertz, and 1296 megahertz. And you can see them here. 3.5 megahertz is somewhere around here. Notice you have a high exposure limit. 50 megahertz is around here. You notice you have a kind of relatively low exposure limit. 440 megahertz is quite all the way somewhere around here, and therefore it's a high exposure limit. And 1296 is probably somewhere around here, and it's an even high exposure limit. So they would want to ask you, of these 4 frequencies, which one has the lowest exposure limit? That's what they will ask you. And if you look at the graph here, you'll see the 50 megahertz is the lowest. Anything in this range here, this VHF range, is the lowest value. So before it and above it, the values are higher. So the answer to this question will be 50 megahertz is the frequency in which the maximum permissible exposure, or the MPE, has the lowest value. So this graph here illustrates just that. All right, so last couple of slides. Again, safety first. We need to make sure that we are aware that radio frequency could be dangerous, and we want to make sure that we do not expose people, ourselves, or friends, or family members, the public, to radio frequency because we are operating an amateur radio station. So if you are near an amateur radio station, what affects the exposure are the following: the frequency, as well as the power level of the radio frequency field. So this is an important point. If you change your frequency, it's a different exposure. If you change your power level, it's a different exposure. So kind of makes sense to us, right? So we need to know this for the exam. Also, our distance, what we call the inverse square law. The further you are away as a human being from the antenna, is the less exposure you will have. So kind of stands to reason. The distance from the antenna to a person is one of the factors that affect the exposure. The closer you are to the antenna, so this is the antenna here, this is the person, you come closer, you get more exposure. You go further away, less exposure. Also important is the radiation pattern of the antenna. If it's a directional antenna and it's sending signal in this direction and we are here, then we'll of course be exposed to more radio frequency energy than if we were, let's say, in this direction where maybe the antenna is not sending out as much because of the radiation pattern. Let's say it's a Yagi. So these factors here are what determines the amount of RF or radio frequency exposure that a person gets. All right, so last slide, folks. So there are a couple things we need to be aware of in terms of the maximum permissible exposure limits that we have. And that is, what can we do to reduce that amount of exposure that a human can encounter if they're close to our amateur radio station or the antenna? Well, one thing we could do is simply to relocate the antennas. Put it higher, shift it left, shift it right, so that we will not be close enough to the antenna. And that's this first point, that an action that can be taken to reduce the exposure to RF radiation is simply to relocate the antenna, move it further away. Also, this is a bullet point that's an exam question as well. It says that you can make sure your station stays in compliance with the RF safety regulations by reevaluating the station whenever an item in the transmitter or the antenna system is changed. Let's dissect this question a little bit. What are they telling us here? Well, you have compliance, that's important. You have the safety regulations, that's important. But how can you make sure that you're always in compliance? Well, if you change your transmitter, the radio itself, you change it, you probably put in an amplifier, or you take out an amplifier, or let's say you put in a Yagi, or you put in a directional antenna, you change the antenna. If you were to do any of those things, change your transmitter or change the antenna, you need to reevaluate your MPE or maximum permissible exposure. So any change that you make, reevaluate. And that's the point of this bullet point, an exam question. So folks, this other slide, we're just including it in the slide deck just for reference. You would have seen this before. This is just part of a compendium to help you reference the bands and the frequencies. What is VHF? What is UHF? Where you use lower side, upper side band, and so on. So this is just a little trusty slide that we'll probably repeat in the slide going forward. Very useful for us as a reference. So folks, all that is left for us to do is to essentially race through the question pool. Let's do that. Let's see if we can quickly switch across to our question pool. So again, we would have covered all of this theory in the class this evening. So we'll just quickly go through just to show what the questions look like in the exam. Let's go. Which of the following is included in packet radio transmissions? Well, all of these are correct. And we did a slide on this, said that there's a checksum in packet radio that permits error detection. There's a header that contains the call sign of the station that the information is being sent to. And also ARQ, or automatic repeat request, is there to do error correction, right? Next question, what is an ARQ transmission system? Well, we defined it as an error correction method in which the receiving station detects the error and it sends a request for retransmission. That's what ARQ is. So they ask us now, which of the following is an application of APRS? Well, APRS, it provides a real-time tactical digital communication in conjunction with a map showing the location of stations. Remember we said we use, it's like a GPS for amateur radio. All right, so it does much more than that, which is the next question. What kind of data can be transmitted by APRS? We can have GPS data, text messages, and also weather information or weather data. So therefore, all of these choices are correct. What does the abbreviation PSK mean? Well, it's phase shift keying. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following describes DMR? And you may remember DMR is a digital voice mode. So it's a technique for time multiplexing, or TDMA, two digital voice signals on a single 12.5 kilohertz repeater channel. Right? So very good mode. Digital voice. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following operating activities is supported by digital mode software in the WSJTX software suite? So we talked a lot about WSJTX software. We showed you what it looked like. And you can do all of these things with it. We could do EME, or what we call moon bounce. Remember we say hams love to bounce signals off of things. Also, weak signal propagation beacons, as well as that mode called meteor scatter, where we bounce our signals off of the trail that a meteor leaves back by ionizing the trail. So all are correct. What is FT8? We said it's a digital mode. It's a digital mode capable of low signal to noise operation. Very good mode. Excellent indeed. Which of the following best describes an amateur radio mesh network? And we said it's an amateur radio-based data network that uses commercial Wi-Fi gear or Wi-Fi equipment with modified firmware. So that's what amateur radio mesh network is. All right, so we go now to safety questions. What health hazard is presented by electrical current flowing through the body? We discussed it. It's all of these. It may cause injury by heating the tissue. Cook yourself. It may disrupt the electrical functions of cells, and it may also cause involuntary muscle contraction. It might cause you to hold on to something, or it may cause any other muscle in your body. And remember, your heart is a muscle as well, right? So very dangerous, electrocution. In the United States, what circuit does black wire insulation indicate in a 3-wire 120-volt cable? So remember, in the US, we said black is the hot, right? What was neutral? Well, it was white. What was ground? Green. So hot is black. Next question. What is a good way to guard against electrical shock in your station? Well, all of these. Use a 3-wire cord and plugs for all AC or alternating current powered equipment. Use 3-wire plugs, 3-wire cords. Connect all your AC powered station equipment to a common safety ground. Remember, we showed you that ground bar, and we use a strap from every single piece of equipment to it. That's what it means. And we also can use mechanical interlocks in high voltage circuits. So if we were to open it, it will disconnect the voltage. All right, so all are correct. What is the purpose of a fuse in a circuit? We said it's a protection device, so it's to remove power in the case of overload. That's what a fuse is used for. All right, so more questions. Where should a fuse or circuit breaker be installed in a 120 volts AC power circuit? So remember, we said it's not the neutral, it's not the ground. We install a fuse or a circuit breaker in series with the hot conductor or the live conductor only. All right. Why should a 5 ampere fuse never be replaced with a 20 ampere fuse? Why? Because that's dangerous. It can cause excessive current to flow and cause a fire. Bad idea. What hazard exists in a power supply immediately after turning it off? Remember, we said in power supplies, we have that component called a capacitor or filter capacitor. But even though you switch it off or you unplug it, it may still contain a charge. So we say the charge stored in the filter capacitors is what causes that hazard to still exist, even though you've unplugged it, even though you have switched it off. Which of the following is a safety hazard of a 12-volt storage battery? We said that if you were to short circuit the terminals, it can cause burns, fire, or explosion. So do not short circuit a battery. What hazard is caused by overcharging or discharging a battery too quickly? Well, we said that you can cause overheating or that thing called outgassing, hydrogen, oxygen, those things, and it may cause explosion of the battery. All right, next question in question pool. Which of the following is an important safety precaution to observe when putting up an antenna tower? Well, we have to make sure that we look out for and stay clear of any electrical wires overhead. What is the minimum safety distance from a power line to allow when installing an antenna? Remember, I said if it falls, enough so that if it falls, no part of it can come closer than 10 feet to the power lines. So you need to have that headroom, minimum 10 feet. What should you avoid? Or I say again, why should you avoid attaching an antenna to a utility pole? No, you don't want to do that because the antenna could contact high voltage power lines on those utility poles. So please do not even think about it. What hazard is created by touching an antenna during transmission? Well, we said that is RF power. You have voltages and currents, so therefore you might get an RF burn to the skin. Nasty burn. You don't want to experience it. What is required when climbing an antenna tower? Well, all of these things are required. You need to have sufficient training on safe climbing techniques. You also need to have tie-offs in case you fall. So you tie offs to the tower at all times and always wear an approved climbing harness. Most important. All those are correct. Okay, so trick question. Under what circumstances is it safe to climb a tower without a helper or observer? Well, it is never safe to do. No circumstance. Which of the following is an important safety rule to remember when using a crank-up tower? Well, we said that you do not want this type of tower. You must not climb it unless it is retracted or you put mechanical safety locking devices installed. What is the purpose of a safety wire through a turnbuckle in a tension guy line? We said that it is to prevent loosening of the turnbuckle from vibration. Which of the following establishes grounding requirements for an amateur radio station or amateur radio tower or antenna? Well, it's your local electrical codes. For example, the NEC in the US, or maybe the TTBS published electrical code in Trinidad and Tobago, or whatever you have for your jurisdiction. So the local electrical code will determine the grounding requirements. Which is a proper grounding method for a tower? You need to have separate 8-foot ground rods for each tower leg, and you need to bond it to the tower and each other. That's proper grounding for a tower. Which of the following is good practice when installing ground wires on a tower for lightning protection? You need to make sure that the connections are all short and direct. Which of the following is true when installing grounding conductors used for lightning protection? You need to avoid sharp bends. Next question in the question pool. What should be done to all external ground rods on earth connections? You need to bond them together with heavy wire or conductive straps. So we showed diagrams to illustrate all of those things. Where should a lightning arrestor be installed in a coaxial feed line? So we showed a picture of where it should be. It's on a grounded panel near where feed line enters the building. What type of radiation are radio signals? Is it ionizing? Is it non-ionizing? We said that it's non-ionizing. How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation or radioactivity? Well, we said that radio or RF radiation does not have sufficient energy to cause chemical changes in cells and damage DNA. That's the difference between the two. All right, so who is responsible for ensuring that no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limits? Is it the FCC? Is it the person? Is it some board? No, it's you, the station licensee, that's responsible. All right, which of the following is an acceptable method to determine whether your station complies with the FCC RF exposure regulations? Well, all of these are correct. You either calculate it based on that bulletin called the FCC OET Bulletin 65. You use a computer modeling online calculator, or you use an instrument called a field strength meter that is calibrated for such. All right, a few more questions. What is the definition of duty cycle during the averaging time for RF exposure? Well, the definition of duty cycle is the percentage of times that percentage of time rather that a transmitter is transmitting. In other words, percentage of time that it's on, the transmitter is transmitting. What is duty cycle? Or I say again, why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels? It affects the average exposure to radiation. How does the allowable power density for RF safety change if duty cycle changes from 100% to 50%? So if we reduce the duty cycle, therefore it allows us to double or increase by a factor of 2 the power density. So we reduce it one place, so therefore we could raise it another place. Why do exposure limits vary with frequency? It is because the human body absorbs RF energy more at some frequencies than at others. Next question in the question pool, at which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value? So of these four, we showed a graph that showed that 50 megahertz is where it's lowest. So you could look back at that slide in the slide deck to convince yourself. So they'll give you these four options. The answer will be 50 megahertz. Why? You can have a look at the graph that says so. What factors affect the RF exposure of people near an amateur radio station antenna? Well, all of these are correct. The frequency that we use, the power level that we use of the RF, also the distance from the antenna, as well as the radiation pattern of the antenna. All of those are correct, and all of those affect the amount of radio frequency that people are exposed to. Which of the following actions can be used to reduce exposure to RF radiation? Well, we can relocate the antenna, right? So that's the answer. And our last question for this evening, yes. How can you make sure your station stays in compliance with RF safety regulations? Well, you can reevaluate the station whenever an item in the transmitter or the antenna system is changed. All right. So folks, those are our pool questions for all of the theory we covered this evening. Again, any questions, feel free to send an email or WhatsApp. We will try our best to get to them. Again, just a reminder, we have an extra session that we have recorded that it will be useful at this stage for participants to have a look at. It's a 1 hour and a half or so. We encourage you to take a look at it. It's stuff that we don't really cover in the course, but it's useful to know as radio operators or budding radio operators. Our next session will be next Friday, God's willing, Friday, 30th of June, 2023 at 8:30 p.m. So we see you then. So folks, thanks again for the extra time. We've kind of gone on double time this evening. We're just trying to cover all of the material. We will be announcing the exam session in Trinidad and Tobago shortly. It should be somewhere around the middle of August. We'll get you the dates as the VEs confirm those dates. So we're trying to make sure that we complete all of the course so that when the exam rolls around, you would be ready. So thanks, folks, everyone. Have a good night. Be safe. Take good care.